大家的耐心等待。那有Dr. Stallman 的来临呢，实际上对我们在谈一些这种所谓的自由软体这边的概念跟一些想法，就有一些更好的一些面对面的直接的一些互动。那他也说他 expect 今天的演讲呢也会有蛮长时间，希望更多的 interaction 所以我想本来要很 formal 的介绍他出场，不过我想看起来以他的这个热情跟这个 readiness 的话，应该可以马上让他出来。所以他现在在台北，他还记得一些 speaker 下来，要在这边给大家能够分享，所以他在联络一些事情。I think I got a book last night. Okay. So it's just like many people got right now, and I not know him very well actually, but I know him well about his enthusiasm, his persistence, his integrity, and also his patience, or impatient. But from the book, actually, from the first page, you can see many people give him some kind of description. For example, Tim Berners-Lee say that Richard Stallman is the prophet of the free software movement. And then also the other one say that Richard Stallman is the philosopher, king of the software. The third one say that by his largely successful efforts, damaged the idea of free software. And also say that the other one also said that RMS is the leading philosopher of software. And finally, the fifth one saying that Richard is the leading force of freedom of free software movement. So I think these are many coin Richard's characteristics about the philosopher, the force of the free software movement. So let's wait for when he's ready to get all the stuff shipped from the Taipei now. Okay, hopefully to arrive by noon. So you can see that kind of energetic enthusiasm. Okay. So Richard, are you ready?
Yeah.
All right. So I'm Richard part. Let's welcome.
First, requests for you. If you take a photo of me, please do not put it in Facebook or Instagram. That company is a monstrous surveillance engine. It does surveillance on its users. I say its users, not its users, because the company is using them. And it does surveillance on everyone else on the internet too. So please, if you put the photo of someone in Facebook, you are giving Facebook another opportunity to track that person. We could dispute whether putting a photo of your friend in Facebook is a decent way to treat a friend. But if you're not my friend, that doesn't affect me. However, putting photos of me in Facebook hurts me, so don't do it. Don't do that to me. Second, if you make a recording of this talk and you want to distribute copies, please do so only in the formats and methods that are favorable to free software. This means use the formats OGG or WebM, not MP anything. Especially not Flash. So this means don't put it in YouTube because YouTube distributes MPEG-4 inside Flash. And also don't use QuickTime or Windows Media Player. Also, make sure that it's possible to download the file without running any non-free software, even non-free JavaScript software. So again, don't put it in YouTube. The HTML5 option of YouTube requires running non-free JavaScript code. And please put on it the Creative Commons No Derivatives license because this is a presentation of a point of view. So, this talk is about a free digital society. What makes the digital society free or not? We see many endeavors that aim at digital inclusion. They say they're going to close the digital divide. Is it good to include people in the digital society? That depends on whether it respects their freedom or not. If it's an unjust digital society that takes away people's freedom, then the goal should be digital extraction, not digital inclusion. If a country has people in it that never learned to use Windows, that is a national resource. Teaching them to use Windows is wasting the resource. It's counterproductive. So I'm going to discuss 10 different threats to freedom in the digital society. The first being surveillance, since I already mentioned it. Now, we find that digital technology facilitates total surveillance. Surveillance that Stalin or Mao could only have dreamed of. They would have loved to do it, but they didn't have the technology to watch everything everyone did. But now, with digital technology, it may be possible, and companies and governments are working together to implement total surveillance. Now, sometimes the surveillance is done on the internet. Our internet activities are being snooped on in many ways, but remember, it's not limited to the internet. For instance, there are cameras on streets in our cities, and they hope to connect these to face recognition cameras, and they hope that in 10 years they'll be able to tell where everyone goes all the time on the street. And then there are license recognition cameras tracking cars. And I'm told that in Taipei they plan to make the train cards require people's ID, so they will be able to track every time people use the train. Now, this is an injustice that you can fight right now. You have to fight surveillance if you don't want to be watched all the time. Now, some surveillance is done by businesses, and some surveillance is done directly by the state. But the data all gets available to the secret police. So really, it doesn't matter very much who's actually collecting the data. What matters is who can look at it afterwards. So in most cases, surveillance by business, thank you, is effectively another tentacle of the state's surveillance. And it doesn't matter so much whether company A will show the data to company B. What matters is whether it will show the data to the state. Sometimes the surveillance is done through our own digital equipment, our own computers or products. When that's the case, we can prevent it by insisting that the software be free. You see, if the software is free, users can change it. And if they find out it's snooping on them, they can change it so it doesn't snoop. This is one of many reasons that we should insist that the software we use be free. Examples of proprietary software products that snoop on the user include Microsoft Windows, the software of the iThings, Flash Player, Angry Birds, the Amazon Swindle and other ebook readers which tell a company which page the user is reading at all times, which page of which book, and nearly all portable phones. So these products are malware. Malware means software designed to mistreat the user. And this is not limited to things like viruses that were not supposed to be in the computer. Even the programs that are supposed to be in the computer, if they're designed to mistreat the user, they are malware. But not all surveillance is done through our own computers. It's also done through the services we talk to. For instance, phone companies and internet service providers. And credit card companies. If you buy anything with a credit card, you're being snooped on, so pay cash. That's what I do. I go into a physical store and I pay cash, and I get the thing I'm buying, and no database records what I bought. Nobody ever had one. Internet service providers in many countries make a full dossier of all a person's internet contacts. Phone companies keep track of all the person's phone calls. And if it's a portable phone, they keep track of where it is. So a portable phone is really a portable surveillance and tracking device. It's Stalin's dream. That's why I don't have one. It's every citizen's duty to stick a finger in Big Brother's eye. And that means there are some things we must not accept, even if they're convenient. We have a duty to society, a duty to resist. So, there are also systems that exist for nothing but surveillance. You know, the cameras that recognize faces or automobile license plates. Those systems must be limited technically so that they can't track everybody. Now, what happens? And the only way to limit the surveillance that's not done by our own products is through political action. We must organize to demand that the government require systems to be designed not to keep track of people in general. And this is necessary for the health of democracy. You see, the idea of democracy is that the many who are not rich, who are not particularly powerful, unite together, and together they're so powerful that they're stronger than the privileged few. And that way they can run the country for the good of all of them, and not mainly for the good of a few elite. That's democracy. Democracy does not mean voting. Voting is part of the methods used by democracy to achieve this goal. But in order for the people to control what the state does and how it does things, it has to know. And how do we find out if the government does things in secret? Through whistleblowers, that's how. Heroes like Edward Snowden, who tell us the things that the government is hiding from us. 3 cheers for Edward Snowden. Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray! So, there's a famous old question, who watches the Watchmen? Now we know the answer. Whistleblowers watch the Watchmen. If they can, because the government tends to persecute whistleblowers, to label them as criminals. Either the government says that whistleblowing itself was a crime, or it searches through all the data about these people looking for some crime to prosecute. And this happens over and over. at least in the United States. Maybe human rights are respected better here than in my home. So, in order to have plenty of whistleblowers to tell us the things the government is hiding from us, we need to make it safe. We need to show whistleblowers that they won't be identified, which means we need to make sure it is possible to communicate with other people without the governments knowing who's talking to whom. If the government has all the metadata, if the government knows who has made a phone call to whom, the government can always identify the whistleblower. In fact, the US government identified and imprisoned a whistleblower by getting the phone call records of dozens of journalists working for the Associated Press. And then they saw a certain person who worked in the relevant agency called a journalist. That was enough to identify who the whistleblower was. Then they just had to prove it. You see, if the government can identify who talks to a journalist, then journalism doesn't function and democracy doesn't function. So if we want democracy, we must reduce the level of general surveillance of everybody to a point where the government can't identify every whistleblower easily, to a point below the level of surveillance that the Soviet Union suffered. Why should we have more surveillance than the Soviet Union had? That's a question that our governments rarely are willing to address. Now, I've proposed many methods for preventing systems from doing dangerous surveillance. For instance, if you want to have a camera to look at what happens so that if a crime is committed there, you can find the criminal, well, have the camera make a local recording and don't connect it to any networks. If there's a crime, of course someone will come and take the recording and it will be looked at. But nobody's going to collect the recordings physically from thousands of cameras every day. It would be too much work. So this way we can have a camera that is there when it's really needed, but doesn't lend itself to massive surveillance. What about cameras to recognize license plates? Well, the system should be designed so that it only sees a plate if either that plate is on a list of plates specifically being sought because of court orders, or the car is observed committing a crime, or the license plate is not valid, meaning driving with that plate is illegal. And other than that, it should not notice any plates. Only the plates that should be noticed for a specific reason should be recorded. The rest, they're invisible. That's how it should be. So these are two different kinds of methods. And there are other methods which you can find in gnu.org/philosophy/surveillance-vs-democracy.html. And of course, the systems that enable total government surveillance, they don't just use them against whistleblowers, they use them against dissidents also. It's a great day for dictatorship when the government has surveillance of everything. Now, the next threat to our freedom in the digital society is from censorship. Censorship is not new. But 15 years ago, it looked like the internet would defeat censorship. It would make censorship so difficult that it would mostly go away, or so we thought. And then China proved we were wrong by setting up the Great Firewall, a massive and expensive system of censorship. But nowadays, censorship of the internet is not limited to obviously tyrannical states such as China and Iran, and so on, we find that even supposedly free countries have censorship of the internet. For instance, Finland. Finland imposed filters on the internet in something like 2006. In 2007, someone in Finland decided to do an experiment. He would try various sites and see if they were blocked, and then he would publish a report on his own site. So they blocked access to his site too. But only from Finland. Outside Finland, people could see which sites were blocked in Finland. It was only the people in Finland who were not allowed to know what was being done to them by their government. So he went to court. I'm sad to say that the Finnish Supreme Court approved of censoring his website. It remains on the net, accessible from everywhere in the world, except Finland and maybe a few other nearby countries. Although he hasn't bothered to update the list, so it's probably out of date. So this is one kind of censorship, and it's found in many countries. About 4 years ago, the government of Turkey, which at the time we didn't realize was moving towards a dictatorship, was announced that every internet user in Turkey would have to choose between censorship and more censorship, and even more censorship and yet more censorship. 4 different levels of censorship, but access to the real internet would be forbidden in Turkey. By the way, they recently blocked sites like Twitter because people in Turkey were using it to spread criticism of the dictator or prime minister. A similar thing was recently done in the UK, where there's a certain amount of filtering that's imposed all the time, but actually by default they put on even more filtering. Now if you have your own internet connection, you can ask them to take off the second extra level of filtering. But if you can't afford your own internet connection, then really both levels of filtering are imposed on you. This is tyranny. This is an attack on human rights. Of course, they always start by blocking access to things that disgust people. And they can always spin things to make it seem that it's really horrible to let anybody see such a thing. But they're even censoring political opinions in the UK. And that really attacks the heart of democracy. Now, I think those political opinions are rather disgusting, but censorship is even more disgusting. And if you let them get away with censoring access to something because it's disgusting, they're going to end up censoring a lot of other things too. In Australia, they don't have filters. It was proposed and defeated politically. But Australia has another kind of censorship, namely censorship of links. There are sites it's forbidden to post a link to in Australia. Electronic Frontiers Australia was ordered to remove a link to a foreign political website or be fined $11,000 a day. Now, what was this foreign political website? Was it an Islamist extremist website? No, it was something almost as bad. It was an anti-abortion rights website, which is a really disgusting political point of view, but they have the right to present their opinions, even in Australia. It's wrong to censor even that. Because respecting freedom of speech means respecting people's rights to say things we don't agree with. Everybody's happy to let people say things they agree with. When people say things you don't agree with, that's where you're challenged to respect human rights. Then there's another kind of censorship, forcibly taking websites down, which many countries will do without even going to court. For instance, in India, any material that is considered to offend somebody's religion can be removed just for that without even a hearing. They just give an order and it's shut off. The US doesn't actually shut the servers down, it just deletes their domain names. But the solution is get a name in a domain that's not managed or under the control of the US. So censorship is spreading around the world. Pornographic depictions of children, which may or may not have been made using real children, and sometimes they're just drawings. Even drawings are banned, is something that has been used as an excuse because it's been possible to work up tremendous disgust for this. But remember, no matter how disgusting a work might be, censorship is more disgusting. And we don't just speculate that this was an excuse to try to impose censorship on other things. It was admitted by a representative of the IFPI, which is the International Organization of Record Companies, that they were trying to get filters installed in the name of blocking pornographic depictions of children so that they could use these filters to block something else, namely file sharing. That's what they really wanted it for, and they were using pornography as an excuse. But nowadays, they have become even bolder, and they don't even need an excuse. Now they come right out and say, put on filters so we can stop people from sharing, because we won't get as much money if people can share. And of course, the highest goal of the law should be to maximize our profits. So censorship is another thing that we have to fight by organizing politically. The next threat to our freedom comes from data formats that restrict the users. In many cases, it's because they're secret. Then we call this digital restrictions mechanisms, or DRM, also digital handcuffs. Sometimes the format is used to save the user's own data. The user enters data in the application and it gets written in a secret format to stop the user from using her own data in any other program. And generally it is very popular applications that do this, because the developer found itself in a commanding position in the market and decided, well, if only we could prevent anybody from ever competing with us again, we'll always be on top. So by saving the user, so they made a new version with a new data format, which is secret, and this way the users find that their data has all been hidden from them and they can't use their data in anything else. It's also commonly used for distributing published works. And in this case, it's designed to control how people can copy or view the work. Either way, it's a kind of malicious functionality. And many proprietary programs are malware in this regard. For instance, Microsoft Windows, Mac OS, the software of the iThings, Flash Player, the Amazon Swindle, the PlayStation 3, and probably other game, and I think most game consoles also have digital restrictions management. And in fact, digital restrictions management has been taken to the point where it's used as a platform for censorship. Apple does this. I think Microsoft does this. On an iThing, it's impossible. The iThings, by the way, are the monsters made by Apple. The iThings. Well, they're designed to stop people from installing applications other than those chosen and approved by Apple. This is censorship of applications. So many mobile computers are now platforms for censorship, which ought to be illegal. It should be illegal to make or sell a device which allows modification, installation of different programs in such a way that it censors what the user can install. But they do it. In any case, fighting against digital restrictions mechanisms is something we've been doing for 10 years or more. Look at defectivebydesign.org for our campaign against DRM, and please sign up and help. Currently, the World Wide Web Consortium is considering whether to make DRM a part of HTML5. Various companies that develop malware are pushing the W3C to endorse what they are doing. Now, it's true that they can do it in any case. They already are doing it. But they want the W3C to take their side instead of our side. And in the long-term battle to abolish DRM, every important organization has the duty to take the user's side. And if it doesn't, it has betrayed the users. So please support our campaign to pressure the W3C to reject DRM. Because even though that by itself won't make DRM go away, it will be an important battle in this long-term fight. Could I have some more tea? Thank you. So I've explained about the formats that are secret. There are also formats that are patented, which means that if you distribute software that implements those formats, you could get sued. Now, that's dangerous, especially for the free software community. There are important patented formats, such as the MPEG formats. They're not secret. The problem with them is they're patented. And so many free software distributors, many distributors of the gnu+linux system, oh, there's tea. Oh, I didn't know, thanks. So does it magically? It looks like it's water. Yes. Well, we'll drink the water. But no, I'll drink this water right now. Yes, I'd like more tea. So, some distributors don't dare include the support for MP3 or MPEG-4 because they're afraid they'll get sued. The result is when people distribute files in those formats, they put the free software community in a vice. Because on one hand, all those files are making it very desirable to handle those formats. And on the other hand, you install your gnu+linux system and it doesn't handle those formats. So something's going to give, and I'm afraid what people do is they get a non-free system like Windows or Mac OS or something like that, which means they're throwing away their freedom. Or in some cases, the distributors put in non-free software Because a lot of versions of gnu/linux, a lot of the distributions have non-free software in them. So a company that's distributing gnu/linux might add non-free software to handle MP3 or MPEG-4, paying a license for this, and then they're giving the users software that takes away their freedom. So the conclusion is, don't make MP3 files. Don't make MPEG-4 files. That's why I asked people to follow this precept in making recordings of my talks, because this is my opportunity to guide people towards doing things in a way that doesn't add to the pressure on our community. Then there's the special case of Flash. Flash has a DRM facility, but if we ignore that, it's not secret and it's not patented. But we have been unable to implement full support for it in free software because Adobe keeps on replacing the format with a totally different format. So we have support for Flash version 8, and I think Flash version 9 was totally different, except for the name Flash. Aside from that, it's a totally different format. So they could afford people to write something totally different over and over again, and we couldn't afford to pay people to write the support for it over and over again. So we're behind them. So websites should not use Flash. The next threat to our freedom comes from software that's not under the user's control. In other words, from non-free software. Now, with software, there are just two possibilities. Either the users control the program, or the program controls the users. It's always one or the other. Thanks. Well, I'll finish drinking that water. That's a problem. So, the first case, where the users control the program, we call that free software, because in order for the users to have control over the program, they need the 4 essential freedoms. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you wish for whatever purpose. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the program's source code and change it so it does your computing the way you wish. With these 2 freedoms, each user separately has control over the computing that program does for him. But this separate control is not enough. First of all, because most users are not programmers. Most users don't know how to study and change source code, so they're not able to exercise freedom 1 even though they have it. But even for a programmer like me, I know how to study and change a program, but it takes time, and there's a limit to how many programs I could possibly study and master. And this is the same for any user. Users of computers nowadays probably use hundreds or thousands of programs. And nobody can possibly master so many. So in order to fully have control over our computing and the software that does our computing, we have to work together. We need collective control, which means that any group of users are free to work together to exercise control over the program and make it work the way they want it to work. This requires 2 more essential freedoms. Freedom 2 is the freedom to redistribute exact copies to others when you wish, and freedom 3 is the freedom to distribute copies of your modified versions to others when you wish. When the members of the group have these freedoms, they're free to work together to adapt the program to suit their needs or their wishes. So the users have full control over this program, and this is how it should be. This is what we require for freedom in the digital society. But if the users don't have these 4 freedoms, or not sufficiently, then they don't control the program. Instead, the program controls them, and the developer controls the program. So this program becomes an instrument for the developer's unjust power over the users, and a yoke to subjugate the users with. And that's often why they develop it. See, nowadays, the developers always understand their power. They're thinking all the time about just how much they can use this power to gain at the expense of the users of the program. They're calculating finally, can we abuse users a little bit more? How much money would we make if we mistreat users a little bit more? That's why malicious functionality is so common in proprietary software. I told you already about the surveillance functionalities, spyware. I also told you about digital handcuffs, or DRM. There's another kind of malicious functionality, the backdoor. A backdoor means the program accepts commands from somebody else, like the developer, to tell it to do something bad to the user, without asking permission typically, often without even informing the user. Now we know of backdoors in Microsoft Windows, in the software of the eye things, in Google Play, in the Amazon swindle, and in nearly all portable phones. So again, that software is malware. Now, in some cases, the backdoor can be universal, which means it allows remote imposition of changes in the software. It's universal because that kind of backdoor can be used to do absolutely anything to the users. So any malicious functionality that is not present in Windows today could be added remotely by Microsoft tomorrow. So Windows is universal malware. So is the software in nearly all portable phones. They have a universal backdoor. In the case of portable phones, this universal backdoor has been employed to convert them into full-time listening devices that listen 24/7 and transmit everything they hear all the time. And you don't have to speak into the microphone for it to transmit. It can listen to you from across the room and transmit the conversations. All the conversations in the same room with this listening device get transmitted. And if you think you can get privacy by switching it off, think again. When you push the button to switch it off, it pretends to switch off, but really it keeps running and keeps listening and transmitting. The only way to stop it is to take out the batteries, all the batteries, which may not be so easy, because sometimes there's an obvious battery you can remove and another battery that will keep it running for half an hour. And some of them don't permit removing any batteries. I wonder why. So they're not just tracking devices, they're listening devices. This is why I call them Stalin's dream. And this is why I don't have one. But this is what you've got to expect when some greedy company that is happy to exploit you controls the program that you're running. It's going to, they face so much temptation to make it malware that it's amazing every time they don't make it malware. And I'm not claiming that it's always malware. There are so many thousands of non-free programs. I'm sure there are some which have no malicious functionalities. We just can't tell which, because we can't check them. We can't study the source code. We have no way of telling whether, we can't ever determine that a given proprietary program is not malware. They all demand blind faith. They are all, just trust us software. We're a corporation. You know no corporation would ever mistreat the public, so trust us. Proprietary software today is software for suckers. It's not always malicious, but it always might be malicious, and you can't tell. But with free software, the users control the program. And the developers or contributors know this. We realize that if we were to put in anything malicious, users would see it sooner or later and they would take it out. And not only that, they would make us think. It would be a very shameful experience when people discover you are the one who made a program malicious. So it generally doesn't happen. Because with free software, we have a defense. We have an immune system. The community has one, an immune system against malicious functionalities. It's not perfect. There are known cases of free programs with malicious functionalities, such as Ubuntu, which has a spyware functionality. See gnu.org/philosophy/Ubuntu spyware.html. But it's rare. Whereas in proprietary software, it's the usual case. Most users of proprietary software are using known proprietary malware in the list that I've already given you. So, with free software, we have a defense against malware. The users of proprietary software are completely defenseless. I started the free software movement in 1983. I wanted to make it possible to use a computer and have freedom. So I launched a project to develop a free operating system. You see, the first thing you need in your computer is an operating system. Without that, it won't do anything. And there was no free operating system then, not for modern computers. So if you bought a new computer, to make it useful, you had to have a non-free operating system in it, and there went your freedom. So, as one man with not much money and not much fame, I didn't think I could change this with a political movement. And I didn't know how either. I was not a political activist. I was an operating system developer. But as an operating system developer, I had another way to fix this problem. All I had to do was write an operating system. Then, as its author, I could legally make it free software, giving all the users freedom. And then everybody would be able to use their computers in freedom by running this system. In other words, I had the chance to rescue people from the injustice of proprietary software by doing technical work in my own field. I was aware of the injustice of proprietary software, which most people did not recognize as an injustice. I had the skills necessary to try to save people from this injustice, and it looked like nobody would try if not me. That meant I had been elected by circumstances to do this work. It was my duty. It's as if you see somebody drowning and you know how to swim and there's no one else around and it's not Bush. And you have a moral duty to save this person. Perhaps that statement is too strong. Perhaps there are some other people, like Bush's torturers, like the people such as Obama that protect Bush's torturers, about whom I should not make the claim that you have a moral duty to save them. But fortunately, I don't need to resolve these questions because I don't know how to swim. However, in the real case in my life, the work to be done was not swimming. It was writing lots of software, and I knew how to do that. So I decided to develop an operating system that would be entirely free software. Every piece, every line would be free software. Because if one piece is non-free, that piece would trample the user's freedom. In using that piece, the users would not have freedom. So in order for the system to respect users' freedom, it has to be 100% made of free software. Then I decided to recruit other people to help write it to get it finished sooner. Then I decided to make it a Unix-like operating system for practical reasons. Unix was a proprietary operating system that is unethical. We couldn't use it and have freedom. However, it had some technical advantages and it was popular. Therefore, by making my system Unix-like and compatible with Unix, it could have the same technical advantages and all the Unix users could switch very easily. They would already know how to use my system. They would use it just like using Unix. And then I gave it the name GNU, which is a joke. It's a recursive acronym. It stands for GNU's Not Unix, or GNU. So when you ask, what does the G stand for in GNU, it stands for GNU. Of course, programmers love jokes based on recursion, but in order for it to be a joke, it needs two meanings. The recursive acronym is just one meaning. Why GNU instead of ANU or FNU or SNU? Because those are not words. GNU is a word. It's the name of an animal that lives in Africa. So we have two meanings and it's a joke. But actually, it's better than that because the word GNU is the most humor-charged word in the English language, used in countless wordplays. Because according to the dictionary, the G is silent and it's pronounced new. So every time you want to spell the word new, instead of writing it N-E-W, you can write it G-N-U and you've got a joke. Perhaps not a very good joke, but there are lots of them. So we've been trained to associate this word with laughter. It's the ideal name for any programming project. But when it's the name of our system, please do not follow the dictionary. Because if you say, I'm using the GNU system, you're already mistaken. You see, our system, we've been developing it since 1984 and using it since 1992. It's not new anymore. But it still is GNU. So please, to make this distinction clear, pronounce the name of the system with a hard G. Pronounce it GNU. There's another erroneous pronunciation that we need to take care to avoid, which sounds like Linux. Strange to say, most people, when they talk about the GNU system, say Linux. And they don't know they're talking about the GNU system. This is the result of a confusion that occurred in 1992. At that point, we had almost all of the initial GNU system, but one major component was still missing, which was the kernel. The kernel of an operating system allocates the computer's resources to all the other programs you run. So we had started working on a kernel in 1990, but I chose a design that was perhaps too advanced, too elegant, and then we hired somebody to write it, and various things went wrong. It took 6 years to get a test release. Too bad. Fortunately, we didn't have to wait for it, because in 1992, Mr. Torvalds, who had written a proprietary, non-free that is, kernel called Linux, made it free. So he started writing it in 91, but then it was not free. In February 92, he made it free. And at that point, it was possible for people to fit this kernel Linux into the last gap in the almost complete GNU system. And the result was a complete system, which was basically GNU plus Linux. In other words, it's the GNU plus Linux system, or GNU/Linux system. But the people who combined them were not us, because we still thought our kernel would be ready soon and it would be so much more advanced. But other people who didn't want to wait combined Linux with GNU, but those people were focusing so much on the kernel Linux that they perceived all the rest as a small add-on. Slightly distorted perception, but what can you do? So they started referring to the whole thing as a Linux system, as if our work were all, which we've been doing for 8 years, were part of Linux, a part of Torvalds' work, which is not fair. So when you're talking about the whole system, since it's our work but also Torvalds' work, please call it GNU plus Linux or GNU/Linux. Please give us equal mention. Since we started it all, and since we did the biggest share of the work, we ought to get at least equal mention. So please help us in that way, because this makes a difference for what we can do today. You see, unfortunately, it turns out that there's a difference of political views between us and Mr. Torvalds. We stand for users' freedom. We stand for the community of the users as ethical values. The free software idea is about right versus wrong, justice versus injustice. We say that a non-free program is an injustice. It mistreats its users, takes away their freedom. That this shouldn't happen. We're fighting to put an end to this injustice. Torvalds disagrees. Well, he has a right to his views. But what does he say? He says that he doesn't believe you deserve to have control over your computing. He says he doesn't believe he should have control over his computing. He says he's happy to use non-free programs as long as they're powerful and reliable. Well, he has a right to his views. But it's not fair for him to get the boost of using our work as his platform for his views, opposing the views that motivated the development of the system. And that's what happens when people attribute our work to him. They boost his stature, people admire him based on our work, they imitate his ideas because they admire him for our work, and they ignore us because they don't know that they're using our work. Well, so these people say to themselves, why should I read what these GNU fanatics say? I'm a Linux user. I admire the pragmatic views of Mr. Torvalds. And if only they knew that when they call themselves Linux users, they mean they're using the GNU plus Linux operating system, they might pay more attention to what we have to say, and we might be able to convince them that they deserve freedom and they should fight for it. And with more people fighting for it, we might win. See, it's all about the victory of freedom for people. That's what really counts. Credit itself, that's not so important. But we can use that credit to win people over to the cause that we've been fighting for ever since the beginning. And that's why it's important for you to help us do so. But nowadays, there's another obstacle blocking people's awareness of the free software movement. You'll find that many people, when they talk about free Libre 自由 software, because of course we want people to know we mean 自由, we do not mean 免费. not fighting for gratis software. We don't care whether this guy pays that guy some money. I mean, okay, why not? We're not against paying each other money for things. We're in favor of freedom for all the users of computing. In any case, there were all along people in the free software community who participated and contributed for other motives, but didn't agree with our ideas about freedom and ethics. So in 1998, those people, some of them, coined the term, quote, open source, unquote, as a way they could avoid even hinting at an issue of freedom. Because they keep saying open, open, open all the time. Open sounds nice, but it's a weak concept. It doesn't suggest that there are freedoms you deserve and that it's wrong to take away from you, because they didn't want to suggest that. Their purpose was to cause that kind of idea to be forgotten. So they constructed a new discourse based on the word open, which omitted completely the ethical foundation of the idea of free software. So they never say, if a program's not open source, it's an injustice. You see, if all they did was change the name, it wouldn't be such a big change. But they changed a lot more than the name. They changed the substance too. In fact, changing the name was to provide them with an opportunity to change the substance. The substance of their philosophy is totally different from ours because it's based on different values. For us, the values are freedom and community. For them, the values are practical convenience. And that's why they won't say, if a program's not open source, it's an injustice. Because that's too radical. That's the idea of criticizing a commonly practiced business method is for them too shocking, it's unthinkable. Whereas for us, that's the basis of everything we do. We will go to whatever work is required to replace non-free software with free software because non-free software is an injustice. Whereas they won't do that because they don't see the injustice. They don't talk about it. They don't show people a reason why they should firmly reject all non-free software. So where we say, if you're going to distribute a program, it's your moral duty to give the users the 4 freedoms so that you respect their freedom. The open source people say, if you're going to distribute a program, it's in your practical interest to let the users change and redistribute the code, because then they'll improve the code quality. For us, freedom and community. For them, code quality. Well, I'm not saying that everything they're saying is wrong, just that it's missing the most important point. Well, where you stand is up to you. If you agree with the open source people, you have the right to say so. If you agree with us, please say so. Don't hide your support for freedom by saying open source just because that's what the other people say. That's basically letting the people who don't care about freedom sweep you away in their current. How are we ever going to get more people thinking about freedom if we hide the fact that we think about freedom? We've got to talk about freedom. We've got to focus on that. The last thing I want to say about free software is that schools ethically must teach exclusively free software. And this is not just for some practical benefit like saving money. Although it's nice if the schools can manage to save some money, but that's a side issue. This is not about how to make education a little better. This is about how to do good education instead of bad education. Because teaching non-free software is bad education. It's teaching people wrong. It's teaching them how to be under somebody's unjust power, which is not what we should teach. Teaching people to use a non-free program is implanting dependence, imposed dependence on one particular entity, namely the developer of that program. This contradicts the social mission of the school, which is to educate good citizens of a strong, capable, independent, cooperating, and free society. And in the computing field, that means preparing capable users of free software who are ready to live in a free digital society. Teaching them to use proprietary software is the opposite of the mission of the school, so they must never do this. And why is it that some proprietary developers offer gratis copies of their non-free software to schools? It's the same reason drug pushers offer a gratis injection. The idea is to make people dependent. The first dose is gratis. Once you're dependent, then you'll have to pay. So if the schools accept these gratis copies and teach their students to become dependent on that program, then they graduate, and the same developer is not going to offer them gratis copies. And some of these people go to work for companies. The developer doesn't offer those companies gratis copies. The whole idea of the developer's plan is that the schools, by teaching the non-free software, are meant to put pressure on all of society to come under the power of this developer. Now, this is a nasty scheme. But there's an even deeper reason. There's a deeper reason for the education of the best programmers. You see, some people have a talent for programming. They're natural-born programmers. And at the age of 10 to 13, typically, they become fascinated with computers and with software. And if they use a program, they want to know, how does it work? But if the kids ask the teacher, how does this work? And the program is proprietary, the teacher can only say, I'm sorry, we're not allowed to know, it's a secret. A non-free program is the enemy of the spirit of education. It is knowledge withheld from the student. So it should not be tolerated in a school. Schools must defend the spirit of education by rejecting proprietary software, except in one case, when it's the object of a reverse engineering project. Because that's a very important thing. I suggest that this university and every university that teaches digital technology should have classes in reverse engineering. Because it's necessary for the free software movement, and by the way, it's a great career. There's a lot of demand for this skill. If you want to become a reverse engineer, you'll make good money. So why shouldn't the school be teaching this? Why isn't it teaching this? However, I should get back to the point I was in. If the program is free, the teacher can explain to the students what the teacher knows and then give each a copy of the source code saying, read it and you'll understand everything. And those kids will read it because they're fascinated. And the teacher can say to them, if you come across a point in the code that you can't figure out alone, show it to me and we'll figure it out together. And that gives our natural-born programmers the chance to learn an important lesson. That code is badly written. This is how you should not write it. See, how do they develop from natural-born programmers into good programmers? They have to encounter lots of badly written code and learn that that's not the way you should write it. The way you learn to write good, clear code is by reading lots of code and writing lots of code. Well, only free software offers the chance to read the code, read lots of code of real programs that we really use, large programs. So, because there's stuff to learn about how to write a large program. And then you've got to write lots of code. You've got to write code in large programs. But how do you get started writing code in large programs? You have to start small, which means writing small pieces of code to put into large programs. Because you see, writing small programs is not even a start, not at dealing with the challenges of large programs. But writing small changes for large programs is a start. But only free software gives you the chance to write changes in existing large programs that we really use. Any school can offer students the opportunity to master the craft of programming if it is a free software school. But there's an even deeper reason for moral education and citizenship. Every school must teach the spirit of goodwill, the habit of helping others. Therefore, every class must have this rule. Students, if you bring software to class, you may not keep it for yourself. You must share it with the rest of the class, including the source code in case someone here wants to learn, because this class is a place where we share our knowledge. Therefore, bringing proprietary software to class is not permitted unless it's for reverse engineering. The school must set a good example by following its own rule. It must bring only free software to class, except for reverse engineering exercises, and share copies, including source code, with everyone in the class that wants them. If you have a connection with the school, if you're a student or a teacher or an employee or an administrator or a parent, it's your responsibility to join the campaign to pressure that school to move to free software, to stop teaching dependence, to stop keeping its students in the dark, and to stop teaching people to be bad citizens. The first step is usually to ask the head of the school, would you please move to free software and teach us or our children a good education? And sometimes that's enough. It's useful to present a copy of gnu.org/edu-schools.html. But if that's not enough, then you have to start campaigning publicly, showing other people these arguments so as to make them aware of the issue and recruit their support so as to build a movement big enough to ultimately win. Schools have a lot of influence over the future of society, and they had better use it for good instead of for ill. So, for more information about free software in general, look at gnu.org and fsf.org, which is the Free Software Foundation's website, and the money from the things that we're selling, that goes to the FSF. So, the next threats to our freedom in digital society come from internet services, that is, websites, mostly nowadays. First of all, many of them actually send non-free software to the user's computer, and they won't work unless the user's computer runs this non-free software. These programs are usually written in JavaScript. Any program can be free or non-free, and that's true for JavaScript programs as well as C or BASIC or Pascal or whatever programs. But typically those are non-free. And they get installed silently into your browser, and you're running non-free software and nothing is warning you about this. So we've developed a program to help you avoid it. It's called Libre.js. It's an add-on for Firefox. And it analyzes the JavaScript code that tries to install itself into your browser to see if it's either trivial or free. And in those cases, it's permitted to run. But if it's non-free and non-trivial, it gets blocked, and Libre.js warns you. This page has non-trivial, non-free JavaScript. And in some cases, that JavaScript code is there to spy on you. There's malware written in JavaScript, and many websites send this kind of malware. For instance, they might be using Google Analytics, which involves a piece of JavaScript code that sends information about you to a Google server. Now, I don't think it's right for websites to give a company information about everyone that visits. I don't think that they should do that. Libre.js will block that. Libre.js does one more thing. It searches heuristically through the site, looking for how to complain to the webmasters. And it tells you on the screen exactly how to complain, so you can send a complaint very quickly and easily. And you should complain. It's very important to complain. And the complaint doesn't have to be detailed. Just, I couldn't use your site because it tried to make me run non-free JavaScript code. Please fix that. Because that'll take you less than a minute. If you send 10 complaints a day, it will take you 10 minutes or less. And you'll be helping us. Because how are we going to convince the webmasters of millions of websites to stop doing this? We've got to get them a lot of complaints. So, the next bad thing that websites can do is collect personal data and show it to somebody who shouldn't get it. Now, a lot of websites do surveillance. And they do more surveillance than you might think. For instance, a lot of websites tell Facebook about all their visitors. They do this through a like button. If you look at a page that has a like button, Facebook knows that your computer visited that page. How does it know? Because the image of the like button comes from a Facebook server. So when your browser displays the page, it fetches the image and displays it, but it gets that image from a Facebook server, so the Facebook server knows the IP address of your computer, and it knows which page you're looking at because the HTTP protocol tells it. So Facebook knows that this computer visited this page. Facebook shouldn't find that out. So our browser, IceCat, blocks these like buttons. Basically, it blocks third-site material, so that cross-site material, so that all these things that are telling others that you visited this site don't work. But in addition to their surveillance, they also ask for lots of personal information. And there's always some treat you're going to get, some service that you would like, some convenience if you give them data. And then they ask for more data when you thought you were done. And at that point, if you don't have a firm mind, you might not be able to say no at that point. Now, I've said no. I was going to use some website for something, and then when I saw what data they were asking me for, I said, no, I won't use it. No thanks. You've got to be ready for that. You've got to decide in advance, what data am I willing to give them, and what data is too much? And if they ask for too much, you change your mind and you don't use it. Of course, there's some websites you just shouldn't use at all, like Facebook, or shouldn't let them use you. But if you're going to use some, you've got to decide what will I tell them. In addition, there's some that even suggest you upload your files to them. And they call that cloud computing. Because if you're a clod, you'll trust your files to some site. You know, you shouldn't do that. It's really dumb. That means they can tell everything about you. Now, a remote backup service can be done ethically if you encrypt the entire collection of, if you make an archive of all the data and encrypt the entire archive file, and then you upload it, and you've done the encryption with free software on your computer, they really can't tell anything about what's inside that encrypted archive. But other than that, you should never entrust your files to somebody's server. And it's really horrible when universities start telling their staff and their students to entrust their data to some company's servers. You know, this is unconscionable, and people should refuse to use it. I would. But there's this threat people understand, maybe not in full detail, but we know that our privacy is threatened if we save our data on any company's server, especially if it's a US company. Which is not to say that any other company is any better, any other country is any better, but in the case of the US, we know how bad it is. But there's another threat that most people don't even recognize, and that is you can lose control of your computing if you let somebody else's server do your computing. For instance, suppose you want, say, to transform a certain kind of file. Well, you could do it by running a free program in your computer, and then you have control over what is being done. The users in general have control over this process. But suppose you put the file in a server which says it'll reformat the file for you, and then you download the result. Then the users have no control over how this is done. It's the server owner that has control. What we see is that letting somebody else's server do the computing for you creates the same problem as using a non-free program. Namely, the users don't control what it does. These are two different paths to the same bad consequence. If you do the job using a non-free program, then you have a copy, but you don't control what it does because it's non-free. You don't have the source code, you can't change it, you can't study it, and neither can anybody else using this program. Well, if you do it by entrusting the computing to somebody else's server, then the programs that do this conversion are not even in your computer. You can't see them or touch them. So you equally don't have any control over what computing is being done. So it's the same result. You lose control of your own computing. And in both cases, what we have to do is clear. Don't do it that way. Don't do computing with a non-free program. Don't entrust it to somebody else's server. When the job is your own computing, do it in your own computer with your copy of a free program. That's the only way the users can have control over that computing. The process of letting somebody else's server do your computing is known as SaaS, Service as a Software Substitute. That's what it is. This service is offering itself as a substitute for running your own copy of a program. But if you ever do that, somebody has power over your computing. And of course, it also invades your privacy, because in order for the server to do the computing, you have to send all the pertinent data to the server. And who knows who else that server is going to send the data to? Big Brother? Probably. As well as profiling companies and anything else nasty that they want to do. So you become just as much as at the mercy of the server owner as you would be with a non-free program. So these are, but I should point out that this issue only applies when you're doing your own computing activity. How do you tell if computing is your own? Well, if you could, in theory, do it inside your own computer, then it's your own. It doesn't involve anybody else. Now, I say in theory because, maybe you don't have a program that does this, but we could imagine a program that does this. There is a program that does it. If you had one, you could do it in your own, you could do this computing in your own computer. Well, maybe you need maybe you need a bigger computer, but you could theoretically have one. This is a philosophical question. I'm proposing a thought experiment here. If this computing could be done in your own computer without any connection to anything else, then it's your own computing. This is the computing you could have control over. So this is the computing you should insist on control over. But there are other kinds of computing activities which are joint activities involving various people. And that's different. If you want to talk with me, that's something you couldn't possibly, conceivably do inside your own computer. You'll have to have it talking to my computer. This is inherently a joint activity. And joint activities raise different kinds of issues. You couldn't possibly have total control over a joint activity. I'm involved. I'm going to, if you were doing it with me, I'm going to have control over some part of it too. But if the activity doesn't include me or anybody else except you, it's purely yours, that's where you are entitled to the full control. So this is how you can tell whether the SAS issue pertains to a certain scenario. Whether the computing is purely yours or a joint activity involving others. And the joint activities raise issues that are similar, but they're more complicated. And we haven't fully understood all of them. We don't have a theoretical framework for that. So these are the injustices that result from websites. The next threat to our, and by the way, more information about the danger of SAS can be found in gnu.org/philosophy/who does that server really serve.html. So, the next threat to our freedom in the digital society comes from using computers for voting. That is, in official elections, where people are voting anonymously. You can't trust computers in a situation like that, because they make it too easy for somebody to rig the election by, for instance, by editing the totals. If after the election is over, you have a machine which just says so many votes for this party and so many votes for that party, how can you tell if those are right? There's no way to verify those totals. You're just trusting the machine to be correct and trusting its software to be correct. But there's no basis to trust it. Even if you had a bunch of experts study the source code a month before, and they said they can't find any errors, how do you know the program that was actually running that day is when people were voting is the same as what the experts studied? Maybe somebody put in the wrong program in the morning just before the election and put the correct program back in after the election, but in the meantime the totals are wrong. Or maybe there's just a way to fiddle with the totals. You just can't trust these things. Traditional voting systems are designed, where people vote on paper, are designed so as to try to prevent fraud. And they function in a way that ordinary people can understand. So people can do the job of checking for fraud. I don't know about here, but in the US, parties send people who are called poll watchers just to look around and make sure no fraud is happening. Of course, various parties send the poll watchers because you can't trust the poll watchers of Party A to complain about fraud against Party B, but the poll watchers of Party B will probably complain if they see it. And the idea is that everything is cross-checked to prevent fraud, except when the voter is actually making the choice, which is secret. But ordinary people can't check what's going on inside a computer. And because computers are flexible in their reprogramming, you can't trust that people didn't change the programming. And the flaws don't even have to be in the software. Here's a real example from the 2012 election in the US. There was a place that had bought computers for voting, and the person would make selections and say, I'm done, and several seconds later, it would show a screen saying, you selected these candidates, is that right? Confirm. But by that time, the voter had left the voting booth. So somebody who wanted to cheat would walk around into these voting booths and push no, and then change the votes and send them in. This person was caught, and I suppose will be prosecuted. We don't know how many other people were doing it that weren't caught. So finding that the system works correctly is not the same thing as verifying that the program has no bugs. Flaws in the election system can exist in other parts of the system. Another flaw that these computers have is they tend to emit electromagnetic radiation from their display screens, and that can be picked up from outside the building. If there are not very many people voting, you can see who each one is voting for by watching what's on their screen. You know, this is not supposed to be allowed. But if you didn't think this was bad enough, lots of politicians want to push for internet voting. They say this will get the younger generation involved because they love doing everything over the internet. Internet voting is absolutely nuts. Washington, D.C. was thinking about having internet voting, so they did a test run. It was not a real election. And they challenged people to try to break the security. Well, the election was won by a fictional robot because a team of students broke the security and falsified the results. But even if the voting software was correct, what would happen if it's running on a zombie machine? The botnet would decide on the vote. You know, it would say you're voting for A, and it would send a vote for B. But it's even worse. Suppose all the software is correct. Suppose all the software is ironclad and unbreakable. What if your boss says, I want you to vote from the computer in my office while I watch? We can't allow that. We must not allow internet voting. It's lunacy. The next threat to our freedom in the digital society comes from the war on sharing. Digital technology makes it easier to copy and manipulate and transmit information. So naturally, people take advantage of this to copy and transmit copies of published works, which is a very good thing to do. It's a form of cooperation in society. However, the publishers don't want people to do this. And they have been attacking computer users for decades now, trying to stop people from cooperating, from sharing. Of course, they don't say they're doing this because they're greedy and want to make more money. They say they're doing this for the artists, but this is mostly a lie, because mostly those companies don't pay the artists, or almost nothing. With rare exceptions who are generally the stars who are already rich. But anyway, they started with propaganda. For instance, they call the people who share pirates. Well, what are they really saying when they call sharing piracy? They're saying that helping other people and cooperating with them is the moral equivalent of attacking a ship. Morally speaking, that's as false as you can get, because attacking ships is very bad, but sharing is good. So let's not call them both by the same name. That name, that word, that usage of the word pirate is just propaganda for the war on sharing. So when people ask me what I think of piracy, I say, attacking ships is very bad. Let's send the Navy and put a stop to it. Which I really believe, by the way. I'm not falsifying my views. And if people ask me what I think of movie piracy, I say, I liked the first Pirates of the Caribbean. So, I'm looking for a very clear, visible way and funny way to reject their propaganda use of the word. Because if you repeat the enemy's propaganda, you're helping the enemy. So don't call sharing, quote, piracy, unquote, or, quote, theft, unquote, which it isn't. That's another propaganda term. They like to say that sharing is stealing, but legally they're wrong. It's not. So, don't let them twist up our language, but if they had limited themselves to propaganda, it would not be a war. They have a right to express their views. We have a right to reject their views. But they went much further than that. They started pressuring hardware companies to put digital restrictions mechanisms into the products we use, making them malicious products, converting them from our servants to our prison guards, our jailers. First we saw DRM on video in DVDs. But fortunately, people figured out the format of the encryption in the DVD and developed a free program that could decrypt it. So you could actually buy a DVD and watch it with free software on your computer. The publishers didn't like that because it also made it possible to copy and share. So they started purchasing laws in countries whose governments surrendered a business, starting with the US. Thank you. With the Digital Millennium Copyright Act in 1998, the US officially adopted censorship of software. So that free program is now censored and forbidden in the US and unfortunately in many other countries as well. Because countries whose governments are in the grip of business, like the US, pressure other countries to hurt their citizens with similar laws. But that software is still easy to get. They couldn't make it disappear. So they developed another system of digital restrictions mechanism called AACS, which is used in Blu-ray discs. Now, people have released free software that can decrypt it, but you have to know the key. And the problem is they change the key from time to time. And so when people find out a key and release it, that only unlocks some Blu-ray discs. So we have not defeated this particular kind of digital handcuffs. And some Blu-ray discs have a second level of digital handcuff, which is so complicated and changes every few months that nobody has been able to break it in free software at all. So a Blu-ray disc is your enemy. You should never use a Blu-ray disc. Because you must never use a product designed to handcuff you unless you have the means necessary to break the handcuffs of that particular product. If you have the free software to decrypt the video of a DVD, there's no reason why you shouldn't watch that DVD. If you had free software you could use to decrypt a Blu-ray disc, there'd be no reason you shouldn't watch that. But this doesn't exist for Blu-ray discs in general, only for some of them. So unless you could verify this in advance, that your software can handle a certain Blu-ray disc, you shouldn't get one. But then they're replacing this with something even worse, namely streaming with DRM. And this is even worse because they could change the encryption at any time. I don't see how we could possibly break the encryption of Netflix. And therefore, you must reject it. A friend asked me to watch a movie with her which she was going to play on her computer using Netflix. And I said, no, I won't. I won't. Even though it would be on your computer and I still would have no non-free software on my computer, I will not legitimize Netflix. It's our enemy. I won't start making that a part of my life. And then we started to see DRM on music. Around 2000 or so, they started making corrupt discs, which looked like compact discs, but they were written funny, so that they couldn't read in computers, or at least not in many computers. So we had to publish lists of these so people could avoid them. And then Sony had a really clever idea for how to make corrupt discs. The idea was, instead of writing the tracks in a squiggly way, they would put some software on the disc. So if you put the disc into a computer, that software would run. And that software was malware. It's actually a lot like a virus. It's known as a rootkit, meaning it was designed to take control of the computer and alter the operating system so that the operating system from then on would restrict what you could do with those disks. In addition, that software damaged the system's security and modified some of the commands to stop users from detecting that that software was present, stop users from deleting those files. So it's quite like a virus, actually. And it was a crime for Sony to do this. But this wasn't the only crime Sony committed. It also committed commercial copyright infringement, because part of that program was code copied from a free program released under the GNU General Public License. And the GNU General Public License is a copyleft license, which means you're allowed to distribute modified versions, but there's a condition, which is the modified versions must be free software entirely. By putting that code into a non-free program, Sony committed a felony. 2 felonies here. But the first felony being the same felony as releasing a virus, basically introducing malware into people's computers. Sony was not prosecuted, of course. What can you do? The government understood that its purpose was to maintain the power of companies like Sony over the people. It behaved like a government of occupation. Anyway, DRM on music mostly faded away around 2007 or so. But it's coming back with streaming services like Spotify, which are all based on the idea of not letting people have copies. They don't want you to have copies of music you're listening to, or movies you're watching, or anything. And that would give them total control. So of course these streaming services use non-free software, and it's non-free malware because it has digital handcuffs. And then they started doing it in books. They tried the first time around 2000. There was a big PR campaign to prepare everybody to desire to read ebooks, and then they were going to start selling the readers and the books. One publishing company decided that it could get its user-restricting ebooks selling with a bang to technology fans if they started with a biography of me. So the publisher sent an author to ask me to cooperate, and I said, not unless this ebook is distributed without encryption. The publisher said no. So the book eventually got written for another publisher and published this under a free license. But they made money selling copies, which was exactly what I expected and wanted them to do. Because remember, free is about freedom. Doesn't mean it has to be gratis. Anyway, ebooks were a failure back then. And I told people they'll try again. And they did. We see products like the Amazon swindle and the Barnes & Noble schnook and the Sony shredder and various other nasty things, which attack the traditional freedoms of readers of books, like the freedom to acquire a book anonymously by paying cash, which is the only way you should ever buy a book, because it's a threat to human rights to have a database that knows what books each person has read, but that's what Amazon does. So I never buy a book or anything from Amazon. I don't want Amazon or anybody to know what I bought. Then, but in addition, they spy a lot more. They report exactly what page of what book is being read at any time, and if the user enters any notes, Amazon can get the notes. And then there's the freedom to give the book to somebody else after you finish reading it, or lend it to various people when you wish, or sell it to a used bookstore. With the swindle, these are blocked by DRM, and Amazon says that you're not allowed to do it because Amazon says you don't own the book. Amazon does not respect private property because Amazon says that all the books belong to Amazon. All your books belong to us. And then there's the freedom to keep the book as long as you wish, which Amazon abolishes with a back door. The Amazon swindle has a back door that can be used to remotely erase books. We know of this because in 2009, Amazon remotely erased thousands of copies of a particular book, an Orwellian act. And the book was 1984 by George Orwell. So ironic that it made people laugh as well as get angry. So there was a lot of criticism, and Amazon promised it would never do this again unless ordered to by the state. Which, if you've read 1984, is not very comforting. Because it presents a totalitarian state whose crimes begin with burning books it doesn't like. The official name of that product is the Kindle. Kindle means to start a fire, and I suppose the point is that its real purpose is virtually burning people's books at a distance. But it will never get any of my books, because I will never use a product like that. So, the war on sharing began with DRM, but it didn't stop there, because then they started buying the laws imposing censorship to ban free programs that could break the handcuffs. And then that wasn't enough, so they started attacking people who were using peer-to-peer sharing. For instance, then they started suing teenagers for hundreds of thousands of dollars for sharing. And then they started another attack against peer-to-peer networks by abolishing the basic principle of justice: no punishment without a fair trial. And what they're doing is they're punishing people for being accused of sharing. This is what was adopted as a law in the UK. In the UK, officially, people who get accused of sharing will be punished. They can be fined, they can be sentenced to lose their internet connection. Obama wanted to do the same thing in the US, but there it's unconstitutional. So he came up with a clever way to bypass this. In the US, this is not a law. It's just a deal between the 5 major ISPs and the copyright industry, where the ISPs have agreed to punish their own customers if the customers are accused of sharing. And Obama was directly behind this deal. And also, filters are being imposed, blocking people's access to sharing sites. And in Japan now, downloading an unauthorized copy of anything from the internet is punished with 2 years in prison. And if that doesn't work, I suppose they'll start executing people. Because these companies are determined to get all the money they dream of, and they don't care what they have to crush along the way. But it's no accident that they keep coming out with new, nasty, cruel measures, because sharing is good, and with digital technology, naturally sharing is easy. So people share, and the only way to stop people from sharing is to be nasty to them. Really, what's wrong here is not just the methods used, it's the purpose. The idea of stopping people from sharing is wrong. So we must legalize sharing. We must completely end the war on sharing. Sharing must be legal. But what exactly is sharing? Sharing means non-commercial redistribution of exact copies. This is what has to be legal for all published works. Of course, to keep this legal, we have to prohibit the end-user license agreements by which the publishers take away even more of the user's rights. So if copyright law is changed to say you're allowed to share, we have to make sure also that they can't impose any restrictions beyond copyright law itself. We also have to ban DRM. Now, the publishers say that they're doing this for the artists. It's mostly a lie, because mostly they're doing this to enrich themselves, and only a little of it trickles down to the artists, except for a few stars who get treated well only because they have clout. Most artists don't have any clout, so they're treated very badly. So the publishers say, for the sake of the artists, we have to let the publishers oppress us. No, that's not a valid conclusion. But it's true that if we want to have art, we should support artists somehow. Not by subjecting ourselves to the unjust system of today, but somehow. So I propose two methods to do this. One is through the government. The government can amass some funds to distribute to artists. Now, they could come out of the general budget, they could come from a special tax on internet connectivity. It doesn't really matter which method the government gets this money. The point is, each year there will be a certain amount to distribute to artists. Now, just to be conservative, let's say that we distribute it to artists based on their popularity. That's what the existing system is supposed to do, so let's stick with that. We can measure their popularity by a system of polls or sampling of what people do anonymously. We can also measure the frequency of sharing various works in peer-to-peer networks, because after all, that activity takes place in public. Once we get a popularity figure for each artist, then what? How does that translate into the division of the money? The obvious way is divide the money in linear proportion to popularity. But that gives bad results. With linear proportion, if A is a star, and A is 1,000 times as popular as good, appreciated, non-star artist B, then A would get 1,000 times as much money as B, which is wasting most of the money. In order to give B enough that it would help B avoid the need for a day job, we have to make A tremendously rich, which is wasting our money. So, to use the money more efficiently, I propose that we take the cube root of each artist's popularity. The cube root looks like this, sort of. It keeps on rising, but slowly. So, the cube root of 1,000 is 10. Therefore, if A is 1,000 times as popular as B, with the cube root, A will get 10 times as much money as B. Not 1,000 times, just 10 times. So the effect of the cube root is to transfer most of the money from a few stars to the mid-range popularity artists. Now, I'm not saying the cube root is the perfect function. Maybe the fourth root is better. I don't know. There are lots of functions that look sort of like this. Somebody else can figure out which one is best. So this way, our money would be used efficiently to support the artists that are appreciated, but are not becoming rich from other channels. This is the way we can really support the arts with our money in an efficiently. But there's another method, which is voluntary payments. Now, a lot of artists are already being supported by voluntary payments. They say to people, send me $50 and I'll send you this beautifully decorated CD, or send me $500 and we can have dinner together. I mean, these are fairly large payments because that's what's efficient today. So people support them, but it's only a few. My idea is every player should have a button where you send a small sum of money to the artists, anonymously. And you can do it or not. And if you don't do it, there's no punishment. But if you do it, you feel good. Now, what would be a good amount of money? Maybe 10 yuan. The idea is to make it small enough that people will be happy to give it, but still big enough that it adds up. If you made it really tiny, then even if everybody pushed the button, the artist would get little. So there should be some optimal quantity that maximizes the total that people send per day or per year for whatever unit time. And that, I think, would be the best quantity to use. It would support artists the most. And then you might just, if you like something, you'd push the button. Unless you're poor. If you're poor, you'll never push the button because you really can't afford even a small amount. But there are plenty of non-poor people who can give that amount of money and won't miss it, and they'll feel good. Like probably every one of you. You could give 10 yuan every day, and you wouldn't miss the money as an expense. Why don't you do it now? Just because it's too hard. So I'm saying, let's make it easy, and then you'll do it. Now, these are methods for supporting artists that are compatible with legalizing sharing. They're not based on the assumption that nobody shares. The artist would be happy that you share. They would say, please, here's how you can share my work with other people so they can see it and like it. And this is much healthier for art. The last threat to our freedom in the digital society is something that I recognized when I was thinking about the deal that Obama arranged between the main US ISPs and the copyright industry, where these ISPs agreed to punish their own customers. How could they do that? It's because the customers have no rights. In fact, this is just part of a bigger problem. The users of the internet have no right to do anything. We can only use the internet on sufferance if certain companies are willing to let us. Now, if you have some views that you want to express to the public, you can make a sign, you can make handouts, and then you can walk out on the street carrying your sign and giving out handouts. You don't need to get a company to say it's okay. You have a right to do it. But if you want to do the same thing on the internet, you need the cooperation of an ISP, a hosting company, and a domain name registrar. And any of them can decide that they don't like you, they don't like what you're saying, so they can invent a reason to claim you violated their terms of service and cut you off. After all, they write the terms of service and they interpret the terms of service. It's purely up to them, really, to let you keep using the service or not. Now, suppose you want to collect money for the cause. On the street, all you need is a box, and people can put cash into it. Cash is a very good thing, by the way. I rarely use any form of payment other than cash, because I want to be free to pay, and I want not to be tracked. But on the internet, there is no cash. Until a few years ago, the only way you could accept a payment on the internet was with the help of a payment company. And those companies could cut you off if they don't like you. Well, now there's also Bitcoin, and that solves part of the problem because nobody can cut you off from Bitcoin, although Apple is trying. Apple, remember, has the power of censorship over applications for the iThings, and Apple banned all the Bitcoin applications a few months ago. So the only way to use Bitcoin on an iThing is by jailbreaking. And that word jailbreaking is illuminating. The users essentially recognized that the iThing is a computer that's really a jail. Anyway, Bitcoin solves that problem, but it's not anonymous like cash. So it's an advance, but we still have a ways to go. The thing that showed me how bad this problem is when the United States government tried to kick WikiLeaks off the internet. WikiLeaks had rented an Amazon virtual server. A US official contacted Amazon and through intimidation convinced Amazon that to interpret its terms of service, saying that WikiLeaks had violated them. And Amazon shut down WikiLeaks' server. Then they went after WikiLeaks' domain names and they convinced or ordered many domain name registrars to delete Amazon's domains. Then they went after the payment companies, and many payment companies cut off WikiLeaks. For instance, Visa and MasterCard and Google and PayPal, Bank of America, and many more told their customers, we refuse to send any money to WikiLeaks. What I realized is we have to have a positive right to do the usual things on the internet. And the services that you need in order to do them should not be allowed to cut anybody off without going to court. Now, I'm not sure how it is here, but in the US, if you rent an apartment and you sign a lease, the landlord can't just kick you out. The landlord has to go to court and present a valid reason for you to be evicted and get an order to evict you. And to get that order, the landlord has to prove there's a reason. If you've been paying your rent and you haven't damaged the building, it's hard for the landlord to kick you out. If you haven't paid your rent, then often the landlord can kick you out. The point is, it should be the same for the services we normally use to do things on the internet, such as your ISP, whoever rented you a virtual server, your domain names, your payment companies. They should not be allowed to cut you off without going to court and proving that there is a valid reason to do so. We have to make the internet a place where we have the right to do things. So, at this point, it's time for questions. Unfortunately, I don't have a GNU to auction.